The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus journeyed to a city called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd accompanied him. As he drew near to the gate of the city, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. A large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he was moved with pity for her and said to her, "Do not weep." He stepped forward and touched the coffin. At this the bearers halted, and he said, "Young man, I tell you, arise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, exclaiming, "A great prophet has arisen in our midst, and God has visited his people." This report about him spread through the whole of Judea and in all the surrounding region. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
It's kind of nice to be back into ordinary time after the Advent and the Easter season, the Lent season, and all the different things we have to hear about. Many of them sometimes center around death, and sometimes life gets kind of hard to find. And so I was thinking, well, it's nice to get an ordinary time, but here we have a gospel about death, and here Jesus comes to take away that death. And one of the things I started to think about was, I remember when I was younger, my mom's sister had a son who was born probably about 10 years before I was. His name was Danny, and he died at the age of 10 up at Lake Michigan by drowning. And so with everything I had heard about him, I was always kind of touched by how much all of my family really loved him and how much they really missed him. And she was, at that time, my aunt's only son. And then in my mid-20s, my godmother/aunt, I got to be pretty close with her whole family. My uncle was my mom's brother, and so I got to know her side of the family pretty well, and they became just like my own family. But during that time of knowing them, two of my aunt's sons had died kind of unexpectedly, probably in the 50s, and so that was kind of a tough thing for her to watch two of her sons die kind of suddenly as they did. And then coming back here, back in 2003, my aunt, or my mom's sister once again, who was divorced by that time, had her second son who also died of pneumonia while I was back here. So there was two losses for her, for my aunt and then also for my godmother's mother. And so it was kind of a tough thing to see and to kind of look back on how death can kind of creep into our families a little bit unexpectedly. And I think probably some of you may have had similar experiences, but it's always a tough thing. And I think through it all, we really get to know God just a little bit better. We get a little bit closer to God than maybe that we were before. And I always kind of think back to how God must have been there with them at that time. But in today's world, we hear in the news often about how soldiers have been killed in Iraq, and we hear about people being murdered on military bases or killed on the streets of Boston, or massacres on school campuses and other public areas, and it doesn't seem like it's going to stop for these young people to be killed. Yet we can pray that Jesus will be with them too. And in the first reading in the Gospel, we hear the stories of God bringing back two children back to life from two widows. In the first reading, we hear God working through Elijah to bring back the widow's son back to life after they thought that he was dead. And in the Gospel, we hear Jesus bring back to life the only son of a widow in Nain. And so we hear about God's great compassion that he has for humanity and wanting life to still stay strong. But the common element in both accounts is that they are centered around two widows who seemingly lost sons. And so why does God bring them back? Could it be that God could see the difficulty that the women had gone through in dealing with the loss of their husbands? Or could it be that God could see that the women needed someone to channel their love through, namely their sons? And so we probably will never know the actual answer to that, but we can kind of suppose that could be part of it. And so when there's a death, it usually does one of two things. It makes people a little bit angry why God would let them die. Or the people feel the absence in their lives, and they need to have God a little bit more close in their lives to fill up that absence and that emptiness. However, our faith in God is not the reason for them to live or to die, but often a deeper faith can result from someone who by the grace of God lives when it seems that they could have died. At least that is what God would hope. So there's something very important to remember. As the Psalms remind us, we live 70 to 80 years in this world if we are strong. But with God, we can live forever. It is always our choice, and what we choose is not God's choice, but it is ours. So if we live foolishly here on this earth, placing our values and work towards only worldly things, we will have a hard time getting into heaven. However, if we live for God and in all that we do, God will have a magnificent end and a home ready for us when we die from this world to his heavenly kingdom. And so for all of us, hopefully, it will be the latter. As I was finishing up looking at the gospel and praying over it, I kind of remember back to in my first assignment down in Pekin, I was down to visit a lady probably in her late 80s in the hospital there in Pekin, and the whole family was around her, and they had thought that she was going to die that evening. And so I remember waking up the next morning and thinking, I wonder if she was alive or what happened to her. So I came to find out about 5 months later that she actually came out of that, and she lived for another 5 months. And so they had called me about that time to take care of the funeral for them. And so it was just kind of a strange thing how God can work, and I don't know if there's ever any reason why he picks certain people over others to live, but it's always amazing to think that God too can always work through any of us to keep people alive in our lives for just a little bit longer.